Good evening everyone and welcome to the third special meeting of the 174th session of Queen's Literary and Scientific Society, or the Literific. I am the Chair, Tasha McSwarren, and I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight and thank the Imagine Festival for inviting us to speak on such an important topic 25 years on from its implementation. Tonight's debate is This House Believes the Good Friday Agreement has failed our generation, and we are going to start with the vote of prior opinion. If you side with the proposition, so you believe that the GFA has failed our generation, please raise your hand now. If you want to. Oh, if you believe that the GFA has failed our generation, please raise your hand now. Let's say 5.
6. We can't 6. We'll go for 6.
Yeah, go for 6. And if you side with the opposition and believe the GFA has not failed our generation, please raise your hand now.
Tough question.
And if you'd like to abstain on motion, please raise your hand now. Oh, you will? Can I have the vote of prior opinion?
On the motion, there were 6 votes for the proposition, 40 for the opposition, and 7 abstaining votes.
Yeah, so right now the opposition have it. So brilliant. I'd like to introduce the speakers for tonight's debate. On the proposition opening, we have Tom Burns, who is a law and politics student at Queen's, as well as the current outreach officer at the Literific. Second proposition, we have Lord Weir of Ballyholme, who is the former Minister for Education of the NI Executive and was an MLA from 1998 to 2022. Third proposition, we have Dr. Stephen Goss, who is an academic historian and also who was a council member on Literific over a decade ago and an honorary life member currently. And closing the proposition tonight, we have Ciara Swale, who is training officer of the 173rd session of Literific, in addition to being an honorary life member as well. Opening the opposition, we have David Kerr, who was Special Advisor to First Minister David Trimble from 1998 to 2002. Second opposition, we have Owen Tennyson, who was an MLA for the Upper Band since May of last year and a former chair of Alliance Youth. Third opposition, we have Councillor Seamus DeFoycha, who is Belfast City Councillor Liz Harris since May of 2019 and a Literific trustee. And closing tonight's debate for the opposition is Roisin Keenan, who is the President of Queen's Feminist and Equality Society and Events Officer for Queen's Politics Society. Now, before we start, I'd like to go over some rules. For guest speeches, you have 10 minutes to speak, and for students, you only get the 7 minutes we usually give you at Literific. First and last minute will be protected time. You will know this is over once the bell rings. If anybody wants to POI, you have to put up your hand and say POI or say on that point. No barking, so if you give a POI, please wait at least 15 seconds to give another one if they deny it. And please keep your POIs to around 10 seconds long. And also, if your POI doesn't get accepted, there is time for questions at the end, so save it for later. And with that, I would like to welcome Tom Burns to open the proposition.
Sorry, just one question, just on procedure. If there is a POI or take POI, does that come out of the speaker's time or something?
Comes out of the speaker's time.
Okay, thank you.
Madam President, members of the proposition, members of the opposition, members of the House. It is an honour to open this case with the proposition tonight that this House believes that the Good Friday Agreement has failed our generation. And as you can see, the proposition's generation is quite definitely Gen Z. Dr. Goss was outside doing TikTok dances earlier on, and Lord Weir is probably a sort of backflash 0.5 selfie whenever we're all finished. But at 25, the Good Friday Agreement, itself on the upper end of the Gen Z spectrum, is one of the most important documents ever signed in the long and troubled history of these islands. It was and remains a feat for the ages, but now in this new age of Northern Ireland, our young people are feeling the brunt of a consistent and subsequent line of failures in the form of a broken and entrenched political system, the much lamented brain drain, and the unfinished legacy of peace. Now, I'll be honest, it's disappointing to see only one MLA here tonight, although I do welcome him. But I'd love to know what the other 89 are doing at the minute. The past year of political non-happenings up on the Hill is indicative of a quarter century of broken leadership and stop-start governance, which we can all agree is more stop than start. The power-sharing executive, and the jewel in the crown of the Good Friday Agreement, is by its own hand stuck in a continuous and seemingly eternal cycle of deadlock, division, election, deadlock, division, election, short-term executive, backstabbing, briefing out, dissolution, deadlock, division, etc., etc. The mothball chamber sits empty, and all the while we suffer. Our cancer strategy has been stopped, prisoner care has been hindered, our economic potential unfulfilled, infrastructure unapproved and underspent. And all because the executive continues to collapse under the weight of its own internal politicking. And I admit, I do see this is in large part due to the immaturity and the myopia of some of our political leaders, but the system itself is an active neighbour. My apologies to my colleague on the proposition, but as an example, the DUP know that if they don't get their way on, let's say, the protocol or first mentorship, delete as applicable, all they have to do is refuse to enter the executive and everything grinds to a halt, and the same goes for all the other parties involved. What's more, the party knows that it isn't going to erode their base. A recent Lucid Talk winter tracker has the DP sitting steady at 25%, putting them well ahead of the closest unionist rivals. Now, many people blame St Andrews for the complete uselessness of our institutions, and that does have its part to play, and it's a strong argument to be made. But it has to be noted that we would not have had St Andrews in the first place if not for the total breakdown of working relationships before 2002. Dysfunction is almost ingrained into our system, and it's affecting all of us, and young people especially. It's taking away our chances and our opportunities. And as a direct result of our characteristic political instability, the North suffers from a chronic brain drain, with some of our best and brightest feeling no option but to leave in search of better opportunities elsewhere, whether for work or for study or just for a new life. Now, it's fairly obvious that I was not one of those people, and for that I do have the Right Honourable Lord Weir to thank and his fantastic algorithm which put me in this place today. But despite that algorithm, thousands of my peers have left home and most are unlikely to return. My friend Kate went to Manchester to study law with no intention of coming home. Aidan is in Dublin studying maths, he has no intention of coming home. Connor is in the United States studying science and has no intention of coming home. According to a Financial Times article from last year, over 17,000 young people left in 2018-19, with only 3,000 people staying. And of that 17,000, 2/3 are not going to come back. We're shipping off the best talents of our generation because of the failures of our government, the failures of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, I'm all for boosting trade, but our young people should not be one of our leading exports. There have been solutions proposed. The SDLP's Make Change programme plans to recruit more graduates, professionals and school leavers into the civil service, and I do admit the civil service is the best way to get hold of the reins of power here because no one else is going to do anything. But we don't need to inflate our public sector more than it already is. Department for Economy figures show that our public sector is far more bloated than it should be, accounting for 27% of all jobs in the North compared to the average of 18% in the rest of the United Kingdom. We don't need this. We don't need the continuous brain drain. We don't need the lack of opportunities. We need workable, practical and realistic solutions which incentivise our young people to stay, to work, to study and to make their lives here. Now, on this point, I'm a dairyman and the lack of opportunities, the lack of education, the lack of jobs is a story that we know all too well in the North West. Historic and current underinvestment, inadequate road and rail links, the lowest level of third level qualification in the British Isles. Our restricted McGee campus is now expanding, but I fear it is too little, too late. It has already failed us. Derry has among the highest mental health and suicide rates here, as a direct result of political and policy failures, as a direct result of the lack of opportunities that we have. Not a single person in Derry has been left unaffected by this. We have all lost friends, we have all lost family, we have all lost colleagues, and the story is the same across Northern Ireland. A chronic and continuous lack of opportunity means that we are losing our young people. With inadequate facilities to help, we will continue to lose them. This will continue to happen. Systemic failures to invest in and expand our vibrant economic and academic hubs has failed us time and time again, and will continue to fail us time and time again into the future. Now, I have to admit, I can't deny the Good Friday Agreement marked a turning point for us all, and a turning point for the better. We hold all of those involved, rightfully so, on a pedestal. Names like Hume, Trimble, Mullen, they deserve their place in the history books. But what we need to realise is that they're not confined only to the history books. The peace process is, checks notes, a process. It's dynamic, it's evolving, it requires work and effort to be made better, work which is not being put in currently. Its opening declaration of support speaks of dedicating, of striving, of a commitment. If we see the agreement solely through the static lens of just bringing peace and not of making Northern Ireland work for the future, we lose perspective of what it could be and what we could be. And yet I fear we have lost this perspective. The agreement gave us peace, and for that I am grateful. But we deserve more than peace. We deserve functioning, inspirational leadership. We deserve accessible and competitive education. We deserve plentiful, well-paying jobs. We deserve opportunities and experiences to rival those, not just in the British Isles and Ireland, but across Europe and across the world. We need to improve. We need this to improve not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone in society. We deserve more, and on that I am proud to commend this motion to the House. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight in this remarkable anniversary year. My view of the proposition before us tonight is very simple. The Good Friday Agreement didn't fail this generation, it saved it. In order to properly examine whether the Good Friday Agreement did fail this generation in the 25 years since 1998, we need to compare the experience of my generation in the 25 years before 1998. I was born in 1974 in County Fermanagh. I come from a generation, and Ryan mentioned this as well, that grew up with Bloody Sunday, Bloody Friday, Kingsmill, Brighton, Enniskillen, Shankill and Grayscale. The generation of Arlene Foster who couldn't even travel to school safely because the IRA put a bomb on her bus. The generation of John Finucane, who had to witness his father murdered in front of him in their family home. The generation of Sharon McBride, Joanne Mathers, Jean McConville, Paul Maxwell, Lance Bombardier, Stephen Restorick, Constable Michael Ferguson, and Michael McGoldrick, a past student of this university who just graduated 2 days before he was murdered by the LVF in Portadown at the height of the Drumcree standoff as a birthday present for Billy Wright. I'm from the generation that took those dreaded phone calls many, many times when bad things happened. Like the time my brother phoned me on the morning of Remembrance Sunday in 1987 from a telephone box in Enniskillen to tell us all, to tell me, there's been a bomb. There's a pile of people killed. They must have put it in the building beside the war memorial. I'm from that generation of bombed out town centres, burnt out businesses, rings of steel, when just being a businessman was deemed justification for your murder. I'm from the generation when just being a Catholic or a Protestant, or sometimes just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, was justification for your murder. I'm from the generation that saw 30,000 British soldiers garrisoned here, 13,500 police officers, all here to stop this country tearing itself apart. I'm from the generation of 25 years of political failure, of nearly 4,000 deaths and many thousands injured, traumatised and displaced. That was my lived experience before Good Friday 1988. So what's happened in the 25 years since Good Friday 98? Well, to look at this, we need to examine two things. Firstly, we can look at the numbers, which largely speak for themselves, but we also need to be honest, as Tom has mentioned, and we need to accept that the Good Friday Agreement has not fulfilled its potential. So let's look at the numbers. Since 1998, we have a 90% plus reduction in terrorist violence. Our GDP in Northern Ireland has increased, doubled in fact, to 47 billion. Unemployment is down from less than 8% to less than 4%. Our GDP per capita is up from 13,000 to 26,000. Our tourism industry in 1998 was a £220 million business, generating that in revenue. It's a £1 billion industry today. Our renewable energy sector is booming. It's the big success story of devolution, as a matter of fact. Last year, 51% of our electricity came from renewable energy sources. This was a project and an initiative that was led by Arlene Foster and by DETI and by the Northern Ireland Executive. We have exciting companies in Northern Ireland now. In the hydrogen space, in technology and pharmaceuticals, Belfast is a hub for AI, blockchain and fintech companies. We have a buoyant film and arts industry. Our devolved government has built new roads, new hospitals and schools. We have the Belfast Transport Hub underway, being built in the centre of Belfast, going to be one of the greatest regeneration projects in the history of this city when it's finished. There is evidence of transformative change in every county in Northern Ireland since 1990. Could it all have happened under direct rule against the backdrop of terrorism and bombings? I don't think so. I don't think so. So why has the Good Friday Agreement not fulfilled its potential? Well, to look at that, there's three areas in particular I think we need to focus on. The first is prison releases and decommissioning. And this was the great flaw in the agreement. Peter and I went separate ways over this point. They should have been linked. No prisoner should have been allowed out of prison without parallel decommissioning. On Good Friday, the government's decided that Jerry Adams couldn't bring enough of his people with him for that to happen, so it would have to be, the can would have to be kicked down the road. That led to incredible instability in the 3-4 years immediately after 1998, and it actually cost David Trimble his political career in the finishing. We got there in the end. The first act of decommissioning happened in the autumn of 2001, but it was more to do with 9/11 than anything else. The second thing, and reason why the agreement hasn't fulfilled its potential, is its advantage agreement. And this wasn't the fault of the Good Friday. By changing the voting rules for the election of First Minister and Deputy First Minister in St Andrews, Sinn Féin and DUP effectively blackmailed their own respective electorates into voting for them, almost in perpetuity, to keep the other side out. So we've had this sham fight over the post of First Minister since. And that is why politics here is so polarised and it hasn't evolved as it should have done. The third reason we haven't achieved the potential, and the Good Friday Agreement hasn't achieved the potential it should have done, is because of Brexit. And Brexit wasn't caused by the Good Friday Agreement. Brexit happened because of Tory pressures and because of rows within the Conservative Party and other issues. But no other issue has had more of an impact on the Good Friday Agreement than Brexit. And we're still dealing with it today. We're in a full-scale political crisis at the minute because of it. But is that a reason to say the Good Friday Agreement has failed us? No. The Good Friday Agreement did not cause Brexit. Yes?
All of these things are still working within the framework that was set out. Even St Andrews is still working within the framework that was set out within the Good Friday Agreement. So this instability can still be led back to what is our political system from GFA.
You can say that, but ultimately, Tom, what the agreement gave us was the opportunity for a new political dispensation. I accept the leaders in charge of it at the moment haven't done enough to take that project forward. It's probably not helped by the fact that one of the parties in that mix was against the agreement. But I take your point. But I am accepting, and I do accept, that it hasn't fulfilled its potential, but it hasn't failed this country. So, to conclude my remarks, I want to say the lived experience that I had before the Good Friday Agreement is completely different to the lived experience that the generation now has had since 1998. I said recently in an ETV interview that I believe this is a 50-year project. It's going to take 2 generations for us to change politics in this country. Dermot Nesbitt, my old unionist colleague at the Talks team, emailed me the next day to say, "That's interesting you say that, because exactly 50 years ago, in March 1973, I was working for Brian Faulkner, and I was his election agent, and the British government tabled proposals at that time which would lead to Sunningdale. That initiative failed, and we had 25 years after that of bloodshed and political chaos." What I want to say to you tonight is my generation was failed by the politicians of the 70s, 80s and early 90s. This generation was saved by the leadership of political parties and leaders in 1998. That agreement gave us a pathway of conflict into a new transformed political dispensation that frankly everybody takes for granted today. It remains the granite foundation upon which our shared future will be built. The Good Friday Agreement didn't fail this generation, it saved it. Thank you very much.
Brilliant speech, and I'd like to welcome the Lord Mayor.
Madam President, members of the proposition, members of the opposition, members of the House, it is great to be back at Queen's, and may I say from the outset that I don't deny the significance of the Good Friday Agreement, which is the most important political document of the last 25 years in Northern Ireland, nor do I decry those who brought about the Good Friday Agreement, and in particular the Good Friday Agreement I think reflects the political vision and strategic vision, particularly of John Hume, and also reflects the political and personal bravery of David Trimble. And I appreciate that in speaking for the proposition, I'm in danger of being caricatured as a pantomime villain, a bigot at least, an opponent of peace at worst. But I think it is important, from a historic and political point of view, to challenge received wisdom and indeed perceived consensus, not least to explain why over 250,000 people voted against the agreement. That's more than just simply a few people who will say no to any agreement. And I would contend that the agreement, the successes which have been attributed to it are, generally speaking, not novel, nor indeed are they, I think they are also at times exaggerated and misplaced. And at the heart of some elements of the agreement have left us with a legacy which has been deeply damaging to society in the long run. So let me take those points. The structures of the agreement in terms of frameworks, of power sharing, of external relations, and even of the consent principles, in many ways were things that had been foreshadowed for many, many years beforehand. Even on the issue of consent, you can find that in 1973 agreements and in 1985 in the Anglo-Irish agreement. There was nothing particularly novel there. Seamus Mallon perhaps rightly described the Good Friday Agreement as Sunningdale for slow learners. The framework that's been established under the agreement in terms of political structure is still pretty much with us 25 years on, but it is not one which has had unparalleled levels of stability. As indicated, the Assembly itself has collapsed on 4 or 5 occasions, and on other occasions has been in deep levels of stress and trauma, with the end result that over that 25-year period, roughly about 40% of that period has been without government in Northern Ireland. So I don't believe it has brought, from that point of view, a level of political stability, albeit that I think in terms of some of the structures were effectively inevitable, and it's difficult to see precisely where there would be much in the way of a direct alternative. Central, of course, is the issue of peace. And undoubtedly, we're a lot better society for having peace in Northern Ireland. There was never any justification for terrorism or violence on either side of the community. there was always an alternative. But the role of the Belfast Agreement in providing that peace, I think, has been exaggerated. I don't believe it is the prime motivator. Why do I say that? Historically, by the late 1980s and 1990s, there was never, I have to say, within either the Unionist or Nationalist community, a majority of people who supported violence. But by that stage, the level of tolerance of violence had reached a point at which it was becoming more and more untenable for paramilitaries to continue. And it was becoming more and more apparent that terrorism itself, in any shape or form, even if you leave aside the moral problems of it, was simply futile. The situation, for example, of the IRA, they were not forcing the United Kingdom simply to break up as a result of their terrorism. The British government was not withdrawing. And indeed, for the aim of achieving a united Ireland, the terrorist campaign forced Unionists into a position where they became more and more determined to remain part of the United Kingdom. Terrorism had become, by the early 1990s, futile, which is why we started to see the ceasefires on both the Republican and Loyalist side. And the longer that went on, the more untenable it was to go back towards terrorism. Hastened, I suppose, in future years by the events of 9/11, there was not a pathway back to the Troubles. The Good Friday Agreement, I think, may well have hastened the blockage in that pathway, but we were not, thankfully, going back to the Troubles. But in addition to the potential successes, which I don't believe were as strong as it has been indicated, I think there are two very major strategic flaws with the Belfast Agreement. First of all, I think it led to a corruption of democracy, and David has already alluded to this. By the failure to grasp the issue of decommissioning and to say to those who are connected up with paramilitarism, there is a direct price that has to be paid to be part of the democratic process as regards government. Give up your guns, support the police. That issue was fudged on Good Friday, and it blurred the lines between terrorism and democracy. It bedeviled the process for a number of years to come, not helped, I have to say, by the failure of successive British governments to be tough on terrorism. And in blurring that line, it contrasted. It is not only did it mean that there was a long period which didn't happen until after St Andrews, where actually those who were committed to democracy had to demonstrate that by support for the police and the rule of law. But it also meant that there was a tolerance of the continued paramilitarism, to the extent that we still have structures on both the Republican and the Loyalist side, 25 years after the agreement, where terrorism, it is not active in a Troubles sense, but we are still seeing it happening today. And sadly, we see it in terms of even dissident attacks. Recently, the attempt at the murder of a police officer. And the problems by failure to grasp that issue of the incompatibility of terrorism and democracy has left us with a bitter legacy. And secondly, I think, particularly as regards the prisoner release, which was, I think, the most significant reason for so many people voting against the Belfast Agreement, it led to a corruption of justice. Because it said there are some people who have committed crime who are not as guilty, not as culpable as others who have committed non-political crime. The early release of terrorist prisoners sent out a very dangerous signal to our justice system. It meant for victims of the Troubles, who took at times very different views on what the best way forward, for them they were denied the opportunity for justice. The murder of their loved ones was not treated in the same way as others. And it has left us with a legacy in dealing with the past that we see even today. Next week in the House of Lords, for instance, we will be debating a further stage of the Legacy Bill. But the Legacy Bill owes its genesis to the decisions taken on Good Friday as regards prison releases. And it contrasts sharply what happened with terrorism, contrasts sharply with the approach that was taken, for instance, to the police force, where the name of the Royal Ulster Constabulary dare not be spoken as a result of some of the changes that were put there. That was a deep imbalance as well. But it's not simply about the past. By sending out a signal that terrorism, and indeed that there was some sort of different standard that could be applied, We sent out a signal to future generations, first of all, that gives substance to the narrative that there was no alternative to violence. It gave a level of justification and still acts as a fuel towards the opportunity for men of violence to seek a new generation to support them. And indeed, the argument is that if it wasn't completely wrong in the 1970s and 80s, then why would it be wrong today? I think that the corruption of justice is something which is deeply harmful to our society, and again owes its genesis to the Good Friday Agreement. Can I say in conclusion, look, it is undoubtedly we are in the nature, and I think a very healthy debate tonight, that we face a binary choice. Life often is not like that. It's not always the black and whites. It's about the greys in the middle. And to that extent, therefore, I think there is a complex answer. But I would contend that in terms of the Belfast Agreement, there was a missed opportunity to have better systems of stable government. There was a missed opportunity for community cohesion and healing. And there was a missed opportunity to tackle terrorism. And that is why, while it's up to the House to make its final decision tonight, I would urge you, therefore, to support the proposition to actually say we could have done better and we should have done better. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Weir, for a brilliant speech, and I'd like to welcome Owen Tennyson to stand up.
Madam President, members of the proposition, members of the opposition and members of this House, I wasn't born when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. I'm fortunate enough not to have lived through the horrors of the Troubles, but I'm also young enough to have benefited fully from the achievements of those who reached across bitter divides in 1998. The agreement didn't solve all of the issues, nor was it perfect, but it did open the door to relative peace and provide a framework for pragmatic win-win politics based not upon division, but upon diversity. Its basic principles were sound and remain the building blocks for a fair share and equal society. A commitment to peace, power sharing, a culture of lawfulness, respect for difference and the principle of consent, strong relationships internally as well as with and between our nearest neighbours, and an emphasis on integration, reconciliation, human rights and equality. The agreement brought an end to violence in a place scarred by conflict for 30 years. That, in and of itself, is a generational achievement. It saved lives. Policing has been reformed and is widely held as an example of international best practice, and inward investment, almost non-existent during the Troubles, has spiked, especially in the Greater Belfast region. It's difficult for me now to comprehend what my then expectant parents must have felt on the day of that historic signing. The sheer sense of relief, of possibility and of hope for me and for my generation. The feeling that Northern Ireland, after years of conflict, had finally crossed the Rubicon. I am, however, confident that they aspired to more than the mere absence of violence, that they wanted peace, not just peace, progress. Admittedly, 25 years on, it's hard not to feel, as the proposition has said, that many of their aspirations have gone unrealised. While it's true that I've never known the violence witnessed by my parents and grandparents, I still grew up in a divided society where my community background dictates so much about my life. Where I went to school, who my friends were, what street I lived on, which football teams I could support, and what my political views should be. In some ways, Northern Ireland is actually more segregated now than it was during the Troubles. The number of so-called peace walls has increased since 1998 rather than decreased. The hard graft of reconciliation and peace building, promoting shared housing and growing integrated education, has too often been ignored, or worse, actively frustrated by local political parties. Despite Good Friday commitments, around 90% of children still attend schools that are segregated on religious grounds, whilst a similarly high number of social housing estates are largely single identity. Though paramilitary attacks have decreased in number, too many still exert a corrosive influence over our young people and communities. On the most delicate of issues, dealing with the legacy of our past, the perennial inability of political parties to find agreement, and the willingness of some to weaponise the hurt has let down both victims and wider society. The costs of all of this are not just societal, they're financial. Research suggests that the cost of division pertaining to duplication of services may be upwards of £800 million per annum, while our economy continues to lag behind much of the rest of these islands. The structures and institutions established by the agreement were designed to compensate for a lack of trust between participants. The hope was that if operated in good faith and in a spirit of cooperation, we could build the necessary confidence to transition beyond their rigidity. Instead, parties have clung to designations and sectarian vetoes, which have resulted in at times a glacial pace of reform and change, contributed to stop-start government and copper-fastened divisions rather than providing incentive to finally overcome and move beyond them once and for all. The most peculiar outworking has been when mechanisms such as the petition of concern, established by the agreement to prevent future discrimination, have been abused to deny the rights of newly visible communities such as the LGBTQIA+ community. Brexit, of course, created even further challenges, placing the issue of borders and barriers that the agreement sought to address right back at the centre of our politics, challenging the sense of identity that the agreement sought to protect and placing tensions between the two co-guarantors into sharp focus. The proposition has already argued, and critics of the Good Friday Agreement more widely will argue, that all of these challenges are concrete evidence that the agreement has failed. They are wrong. I see in Northern Ireland, which for all of the challenges I have just outlined, and despite the many missed opportunities, is immeasurably better, utterly transformed, and is almost recognisable from the one I was born into. While there is still much work to do, it is simply undeniable that I live in a more peaceful and prosperous society than that of my parents and grandparents. For that, I believe all of us, owe the architects of the agreement a huge debt of gratitude. Where we have stumbled, it has often been because politicians have strayed from the aspirations and ideals espoused by those who overwhelmingly endorsed the agreement all those years ago. I believe that the agreement still holds the solutions to our challenges, past and present, and is a shining example of just what is possible when people in Northern Ireland come together to demand better. The Northern Ireland of today is no longer simply just orange or green. It's rainbow coloured. Just as growing numbers of people are not defined by or constrained by their community backgrounds, they're increasingly demanding the same of their politicians and their politics. It's not unreasonable, therefore, for us to expect that as Northern Irish society matures and evolves, so too should the structures and institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. In this, the 25th anniversary year of the agreement, the fact that the institutions are again suspended for at least the third time, possibly more, and for the second time since 2017, is irrefutable evidence that real change is needed. In fact, Stormont has been mothballed for 40% of its lifetime. One could choose to despair that in 1998, our society could take huge steps forward on issues such as ceasefires, prisoner releases, and decommissioning. Yet now we're stalled by issues which are seemingly pale in comparison. Then, the distance between parties was a chasm. Now the gaps are much narrower, but seem more intractable. But I refuse to give in to the counsel of despair. I choose to believe that what we were capable of once, we can be capable of again. Too often, political impasse is met with stick-and-plaster solutions, or worse, those who uphold the institutions and upend the institutions are pandered to, rewarding bad behaviour and condemning devolution to death by 1,000 cuts. That is precisely why Alliance has set out proposals for reform, consistent with the principles of the Good Friday Agreement, but recognising candidly that the inherent instability of the structures created to implement them, and providing solutions to prevent this generation from being condemned to government by nationalist versus unionist straitjacket for another 25 years. To argue for such reform is not to reject the agreement. On the contrary, It's clear that commitment to delivering on its principles, a simple acknowledgement that with the passage of time and changes in our society, and having road-tested the structures, there is room, in fact there is a necessity for us to reform. Of course, in its wisdom, the agreement presciently allowed for its own evolution, making provision for a review 5 years after its signing. 25 years on, and despite our calls, no major review of the structures involving all of the parties to the agreement has ever taken place. Our proposals enshrine power sharing, respect the right of every party to be in government by virtue of their electoral mandate, but they respect the right of the people of Northern Ireland under the agreement to have sustainable, stable government by removing the ability of any single party to hold progress to ransom. No one will be excluded, unlike the current absurdity where everyone is. And if we're honest, it's highly unlikely that either of the two main parties would walk off the pitch if they knew they could no longer take the ball with them. 1998 was the foundation on which to build a better future. It was not and never should be the ceiling of our ambition. The last thing that we can afford to do is become complacent, or worse, delude ourselves into thinking that our work is finished. Building an integrated education system, the promotion and representation of women, delivering a Bill of Rights are all promises yet to be delivered for this generation. Madam President, in closing, on these issues and on so many others, the failure does not lie with the Good Friday Agreement. It lies with those politicians who have never implemented the agreement, with its institutions to ransom, and who are willing to squander the peace and progress we have achieved over the past 25 years. So let's return to the spirit of the agreement, reform the structures, make them fit for our current needs, and recapture that vision of a modern, progressive, inclusive Northern Ireland, diverse but united, and totally at peace with itself and our neighbours. Thank you.
For a brilliant speech, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen Goss.
Madam President, my Lord, ladies and gentlemen, members of the House. I was 11 when the agreement was reached. And I remember from around about that time a particular local TV ad that has stuck with me over the course of this many years, gives you an insight into just how poignant it was. The ad centred on two boys happening to encounter each other on one of our beautiful beaches. And as children want to do, they decided to play together. Having great fun in each other's company, they tumbled down the sand dunes, and as they did so, the contents of their pockets spilled out. As they helped one another to collect their possessions, they see that one had, I think it was a GAA medal, and the other had a badge bearing William of Orange. Horror and disappointment then cloud both their faces as they realise that their new friend is from the other side. But then they smile, realise it doesn't matter, exchange medal for badge as a sign of fraternity, and carry on playing. As they run along the beach together, the tagline reads, "Wouldn't it be better if it was always this way?" That was the future that the agreement offered my generation and subsequent generations. A quarter of a century on, has it been fulfilled? Sadly, the answer is no. As the opposition have conceded, we still have over 100 peace walls. That there are more peace walls in Belfast now than there were in 1998. Despite lip service, education has not been integrated. Living in Andersonstown, but working on the Shankill, I cross the peace line daily and remember the adolescents from both sides, a generation, bear in mind, born after the agreement, arranging to meet at the interface for what they called a recreational rioting. Young people with no memory of the Troubles fighting one another because it has been instilled in them that the people on the other side of the wall are their enemies. If that is not a generation failed by the promise of the agreement, then what is? And yet, these are emotive arguments for the failure of the agreement. Whereas arguably its failure lies in how and why it was acceptable for the majority of voters in 1998. The agreement was approved by 71% of voters in Northern Ireland. The multilateral aspects of it, as endorsed by the sensible parties, were deliberately broad, inclusive and encompassing. This, therefore, is where the problem lies. The agreement was supposed to be a stepping stone to political normality in Northern Ireland, not a final settlement. As a result, it has been augmented by the St Andrews and Stormont House agreements, as well at the same time being made sacrosanct and apparently desecrated by the UK leaving the EU. The agreement has therefore failed in the sense that it was shaped in such a way that it has become the plaything of parties here, particularly those not truly committed to its fundamental ideals. I refer to the fact that 71% of the population voted yes in the May 1998 referendum. However, in the first election of the Northern Ireland Assembly, the anti-agreement unionist vote was almost equal to Pro. And of course, in 2003, the DUP became the largest unionist party and Sinn Féin overtook the SDLP. Things have been downhill from there. As a result, for the past 20 years, Northern Ireland has been, well, I was about to say governed, but that's hardly accurate, has been subjected periodically to rule by DUP Sinn Féin. This has meant that we have been left at the mercy of the caprices of effective Ulster nationalists who invariably put party first, and romantic Republicans who prioritise the ethereal ambition of a united Ireland above the practical, tangible interests of the people of Northern Ireland. If that were not the case, then, as we've heard, Sinn Féin would not have resigned in a huff in 2017, and the DUP thrown their toys out of the pram last year. Northern Ireland has been left without government and local leadership during some of the most disruptive changes to the position of the six counties since partition, notably the UK leaving the EU. Unintentionally, by allowing for suspensions of the institutions, the agreement has been exploited so as to result in inept government and dysfunctional administration in Northern Ireland. It has allowed the executive parties to duck the tough decisions when they need to be taken and avoid difficult issues when they arise by simply refusing to form a government. We have heard from the first proposition a litany of ways in which young people in Northern Ireland are being let down by the current political arrangements. And indeed I could add to them, but that would just be wasting time this evening. It is plain to see how generations are losing out and suffering as a result of the current political situation. The fact that I, like so many others, have had little choice but to move to the home counties is an anecdotal demonstration of how we have been let down since the agreement. I am part of the brain drain of which we have heard. Consequently, successive generations have, and will continue to be, failed by the defective and unreliable institutions with which we have been left. The agreement was right 25 years ago. It was the right choice. It began a trust-building process which was designed to bring Northern Ireland together so that conventional, responsible government could be established on a basis that would deliver tangible results for everyone and each generation. That has not been the result. Instead, a situation has emerged where the agreement is inviolable but can be modified when it suits. While acknowledging that the agreement was right, good and has done so much to maintain peace in Northern Ireland, we heard at the beginning reflections on what Northern Ireland was like before and how far we have come. The arrangements it solidified are no longer working. They are not working within Northern Ireland, across the UK or at the international level. The dominant executive parties are in no small part to blame for this, but the agreement has failed to deliver on its promises and expectations. Beyond ensuring that our society has not stepped back into violence, it has failed to fulfil the hopes which produced it and which ensured its popular acceptance. It has failed successive generations. It is failing this generation. Perhaps worst of all, such is the nature of the politics that it has produced that the only people who go into Northern Irish politics are the Shire who currently constitute our politicians. We should be grateful for what the agreement has given us. Yet, that does not mean that we must turn a blind eye to its failings. The longer we do, the more generations it will fail. I beg you vote for the motion.
Madam President, first of all I want to begin by apologising and saying I know you had my party colleague Matthew O'Toole booked for this evening. Unfortunately Matthew couldn't be here and unfortunately you've ended up with the much less handsome and much less debonair Belfast City Councillor, though I hasten to remind Matthew that actually Belfast City Council continues to function at this moment in time. we are actually trying to get some of the job done. I have a number of remarks this evening and I didn't prepare anything in advance because I was actually quite interested in hearing the argument of proposition before taking a considered view of some of the things I've said. So I've scribbled down some of my thoughts, but I want to begin first of all by reflecting on 6 names that for me have a very personal connection to the violence that we've experienced in this place. Christy Doherty, Jack Duffin, James Kennedy, Peter McGee, William McManus and Lyra McKee. The first 5 names were men who were murdered as I was born. They were in Sean Graham's Bookmakers in the Omer Road, my local community. My grandmother taught some of them. As they were being murdered, my mother was in the labour suite in the Old Jubilee Hospital, in the City Hospital, on the 5th of February 1992. And as a child of the Agreement generation and growing up hearing about the political violence that this place experienced, that was, for most of my experience, the only direct connection that I had with the Troubles, and I understood how lucky I was for that to be the case. Until around about 4 years ago next month, 3 weeks before I was elected to Belfast City Council, my friend was shot dead and killed in the streets of Derry. And I know there'll be some people here this evening who knew Lyra as well and knew the contribution I think that she had to give to this place. And I want to refer, I think, to some of the things I think that our politicians have failed us here, that Lyra very eloquently outlined in one of her last published pieces, which was about the suicide babies, the children of the Agreement who have grown up living with the political failure that has come since 1998, because I think it highlights some of the challenges that we face and those of us on the opposition have to answer, both as politicians or as civic leaders or as citizens. She talked about 3 promises that had been failed, 3 promises that were made by politicians, not in the Agreement itself. My dad, I'm of the view that these are the responsibilities of the people who are elected to office, who have a task to lead and try to build the society that the Agreement gave us space to do so. And the 3 promises she talked about were peace, prosperity, and that your children will be safe now. And unfortunately, I think politics has failed on all 3 counts. The promise of the Agreement hasn't, and that's what we have to try and return to. And it's difficult in the context of the present political situation, whilst we're in the latest episode of We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together, the Stormont version, to think or consider that actually we might have politics here that functions. But the Agreement gave us the space to do that, and it may not have been perfect, it may not have suited what everybody wanted. It was a compromise. It recognised that compromise was the only path towards any kind of solution for this place, that, as has been rightly pointed out by other speakers this evening, that it would entail a process that all of us would have to be engaged in throughout the future. And unfortunately, what we've seen from political leaders is people step away from engaging in that process and deciding that political expediency and elections and votes have become more important than trying to show leadership and demonstrate what this place so sorely needs. In coming to that, I do want to actually contend with some of the points made by one of my fellow opposition speakers, which is about the economic development that has existed post-agreement. Because actually, economic stagnation since around 2001 has been very clear in Northern Ireland. Our investment in infrastructure levels and in construction, the number of planning applications even, have sat at a level round about equal to where they were in 2001 since the agreement. And it's no strange thing that kind of coincides with the significant periods of instability that started to occur in the early 2000s post-agreement, whenever the Assembly started to collapse because people didn't have any faith or confidence in the political leaders of this place to deliver. And that has left behind, I think, a legacy of underinvestment and a legacy of challenges that our politicians have failed to grasp. But yet again, the agreement gives them the opportunities to do so. But for political reasons, people have chosen not to face those issues. And I think of things like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were considering questions about Belfast Light Rail, but it was more politically expedient for us to choose a bendy bus and go with a glider. We're still waiting on investment in the A5, one of the most dangerous roads in Western Europe, where people continue to die on every year. We're still waiting to see any kind of movement on expanding rail services into the West after they were closed 60 years ago. And those challenges have become more acute since the pandemic, and I think of health in particular, where political leaders have failed to take any decisions because they're afraid of the responses they might receive from the electorate. And that matches again with the political challenge of people who have refused to step up to the mark and effectively the watermark of leadership that the agreement sets out for them. Similarly, North-South bodies, which have an opportunity to open up avenues of investment and economic development across this island, and recognising that working together with Dublin should be no bad thing, have been neglected by unionist politicians who don't see any value in them. As Owen has said, we have failed to recognise the potential in relation to integrated education, and in particular in relation to integrated housing. And as an elected representative in East Belfast, I see that most particularly, and we have seen, unfortunately, in my own constituency, some of the worst examples of attempted pilots in relation to integrated housing, where things have been allowed to devolve into a very scary sectarian scenario where people have been forced out of their homes. I think as well, in terms of the issue around paramilitary transformation, I mean, at what stage do we say that 25 years is enough time for people to have transformed away from the particular path that they chose? At what point do we say that when you're recruiting a new generation of people to be involved in those organisations, that enough is enough? And again, all of these decisions come down to political leaders. They come down to the people that you elect and put into office. The agreement does not have a personality, it doesn't have an ability to make a choice on these issues, but it empowers and equips political leaders and citizens to make those choices. It gives us the political space and the opportunity to take part in decisions that will affect our lives. And the reality is that for too long, politicians have just simply refused to step up to the mark and take those decisions.
On that point, this is the same thing we've heard again. It's just like a litany of everything that's wrong here, and then but it's nothing to do with the agreement. But it's that system and that framework that I don't think has been responded to effectively. They're doing a bad job, I agree, but they're doing a bad job within the framework that allows them to do that.
So for that I'll come to the quote that I was going to say at the end, but I have a couple more points that I want to make. We've all, I presume, at this stage seen Dairy Girls and what a fantastic cultural success it has been for this place. And I refer to a brilliant piece of acting from a great constituent of mine, Ian McElhinney, as Granda Joe. And Erin asks him, what if we do it was all for nothing? What if we vote yes and it doesn't even work? And he replies, and what if it does? What if no one else has to die? And what if all of this becomes a ghost story that you tell your reins? The reality is that it is the best system that we have. It has its faults. Again, it was a compromise. No political party got everything they wanted out of the Good Friday Agreement, but it gives space for politicians and citizens to be able to take decisions. There is no alternative that exists to that. There is no alternative to the political sphere that doesn't involve, unfortunately, violence in this place. That is what we have seen throughout the years of the Troubles. I heard it earlier said during one of the contributions that we owe a debt of gratitude to John Hume and David Trimble and the other people involved in crafting the agreement. I actually think we don't owe them a debt of gratitude. We owe it to them to make the agreement work. And that has been the most significant challenge of all of the last 25 years. The sense that we reach this stage where we can have peace, but we cannot seem to move past that because we are locked in crisis and deadlock. And I know that my party colleague, Mark Durkin in particular, who was one of the architects of the agreement, reflects back to the first slipping of a deadline, which was October 31st in 1998, which was the initial deadline set by the British and Irish governments for the establishment of all of the power sharing institutions. And since then, it would be the contention of Mark and others that that first moment of slippage allowed every other moment of slippage, and that is why, in some part, we're in the position that we're in today. I'm hoping that the two gentlemen who were there as part of the process may be able to shed some light on that later on. But I think we have been given an opportunity and a space through the Good Friday Agreement to have political disagreement and discussion and the ability to take decisions. That is the opportunity with the agreement, and it is politicians who have let people down. And very quickly in conclusion, I would say that as a nationalist and somebody who has aspirations for constitutional change in this island, it gave people the opportunity to have constitutional viewpoints and to actively pursue those views and aspirations in a peaceful and democratic way, something which solved part of the challenge of certainly centuries of political disagreement and difference on this island, and that in itself is something that should be celebrated, particularly in the context of Brexit and what the United Kingdom looks like today.
Hello? Yeah, that works. Alright, so young people don't want to be here anymore, with up to 2/3 deciding not to return after graduating in Britain. Why is this? Well, it's due to three main reasons. It's sectarianism, an unstable government, and low economic prospects. All issues I'm going to prove stem back to the Good Friday Agreement. I'm going to start off by quoting directly from the Good Friday Agreement, where it says, "We firmly dedicate ourselves to the achievement of reconciliation, tolerance, and mutual trust." Right, so I think that's the main crux of this entire thing, because we've heard here tonight that all of the faults that are said on our side are due to politicians, right? But I think it's quite naive to think that after 30 years of direct conflict and centuries of indirect conflict, that unionists and nationalists would be able to work together indefinitely. And it created a government that's divided not on parties or policies, but on whether you're green or orange. As the GFA states, that in order to go into government, you have to classify yourself as either a nationalist, a unionist, or other. And this has led into common society, with a common joke being that if you're an atheist, you will be met with the common joke of, oh, but are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist? And don't get me wrong, the UUP and the SLP did seem to want to work together at the time and bring a prosperous new future to my generation. But did not think about what would happen if they weren't in power anymore. And that quickly came to fruition, as with the rise of Sinn Féin and the DUP, this has caused 20 years of orange versus green politics, with bread and butter policies taking a back seat in order of divisive and often sectarian rhetoric to drum up support and votes with the youth, which the youth had to consume as they grew up, entrenching those divisions for years to come. The division and animosity set out to be resolved in the Good Friday Agreement still persists to this day. Our education is segregated, our communities are segregated, our very lives are segregated, which the GFA did little to address. With me going to a Catholic grammar school, a Catholic secondary school, and not talking to a Protestant until I went to uni at the age of 18. With all my knowledge of the other side coming from parents and politicians. Yet we're expected to reconcile and trust each other despite never having met each other. And good luck talking about anything political in Belfast without getting shushed by one of your friends because you have no idea who could be listening in. Which in turn smothers any sort of political debate that you've had in this country, as politics outside of institutions like this become almost dangerous to talk about. Like, for example, years ago, this very Debating Society had to cancel a debate because one of our members was threatened outside of the Letterific. And that is a reality that we all have to deal with. So much for reconciliation, tolerance and trust when we can't even trust ourselves. Yes, go for it.
Would you not accept, though, that for the requirement to have any kind of democratic debate or dissent in this place, that we require institutions and structures to do that? And council chambers are just not enough to be able to provide that type of leadership. The agreement does that through the Assembly and the Executive.
Yes, it does, but it also entrenched a lot, basically through the structure, it entrenched kind of this politics is based on division, and it's become very inflammatory where you talk, it's far more passionate, far more aggressive, to the point where essentially if you talk about politics in this country, they're told to be shushed because you don't know who's around the other corner, which is kind of a problem. So this animosity results in instability. The Good Friday Agreement setting out a government so fragile that it only takes one party to collapse. And oh my goodness, has it happened a lot. So common, in fact, that you can consult a website called How Long Has Northern Ireland Not Have a Government.com to find out that as of today it has been 415 for those who are curious. Additionally, we have only had a government for 3/5 of the time since 1998, and we wonder why the youth of this country are fed up when sites like these are necessary in our day-to-day lives to remember if we're in government or not. So, and this instability costs us money, because the annual budget cannot be agreed upon unless the Assembly is in session, which means that over the years, the public sector that helps our young people progress in life through education, health, infrastructure, you name it, has had to scramble around to carry out its basic function. This also means that companies, the people that give us jobs here, have been more hesitant to invest here because, well, it makes sense, because essentially it's a coin toss whether you're going to have a government or not to allow the permit to establish businesses here. And this has led essentially to our economy suffering. For example, it's estimated that we have lost £1 billion between 2017 and 2022, so over 5 years. That's not counting the entirety after the GFA, by the way, and that's already £1 billion. And that translates to thousands of jobs lost for the youth of this country. So we can't even trust the government to reconcile and to work together in our best interest anymore. And finally, with the Good Friday Agreement, we saw the introduction of the petition of concern, a tool so broken that has been used to hold the nation to political ransom over the past couple of decades, but practically no limitations set in by those who implemented it. And as we know, politicians have never abused their power in all of history. So this has obviously not led to it being used for everything it was never intended to be used for, such as blocking welfare reform, investigations into MLA misconduct, abortion, and the big one, gay marriage. The last two ones being two of the biggest youth-led political movements of our generation. And those were squashed, despite democratic demand for them, with it so bad that Westminster had to step in to do our governing for us. And that's why we're fed up. We're fed up with sectarianism, we're fed up with government that's never there for us, we're fed up with the fact that we can't get a job after it all. And can you really blame us? Because the GFA brought us peace, and I recognise that, but it lacked the foresight, going on to create a government and environment that is so divisive and unstable that we can't get anything done. So much for reconciliation, tolerance, and mutual trust. And that is why it has failed our generation. Thank you very much.
Failed our generation. Not that it is flawed, not that it has problems, that it has failed our generation. Do you truly believe that it has failed us? And I ask the young people in this room, because that is the generation to whom we are speaking tonight. The proposition, I have many points here, lads, so, ladies, so please don't get offended, because I think we've been far too diplomatic so far. So they've sent me up here to change a bit of a tone and speed up tonight. First of all, Tom, you yourself, I'm sorry, you're the first one that spoke. You said that we need workable, practical, realistic solutions to our problems. Do you think we could get that outside of democratic institutions, or do we need democracy to achieve that? Because democracy wasn't really happening when we had the Troubles going on. Do you accept that? Moving on then, Peter, you said that you don't want to be characterised and you're not a pantomime villain. Not a chance. I don't see you as a pantomime villain or anything like that. I just see you as simply incorrect. No offence. You have said, right? And you said that we are without government, and you mentioned the corruption of democracy. You are yourself familiar with the DUP, aren't you? You have said that what we need to ensure, what we might not have been terrible, or what wasn't attainable, was the continuation of violence. Yet the enshrining of that in our government, the enshrining of that in our politics is something that is so important and cannot be undermined, and that is what the Good Friday Agreement has done for us. It enshrines that, and I don't think we should undermine that or bat that away by saying, oh well, you know, people might have put their guns down, you know, if we had let them on continue. I don't think that's a really good argument. Again, no offence, I will shake everyone's hand after this. Stephen, you mentioned the two lads and they emptied their pockets and then they weren't able to be friends. Do you think that they would have been able to be friends in a society of being feared of one side attacking one another? Because now they can grow up in a society without fear of one side murdering the other, and I don't think, again, that's something we should undermine. I don't think we should undermine the peace that has been brought about, which has been, you had your time, which has been undermined tonight over and over and over again. You see it as well, that the Good Friday Agreement or Belfast Agreement was a stepping stone. Surely then it is the fault of the politicians not continuing their walk or their march, depending on what side of the band you're on, but not continuing that walk. That is not the fault of the Good Friday Agreement itself. Kira, moving on to the last one, so I'll not turn these too much longer, but you yourself said that young people don't have XYZ opportunities. Again, we have more opportunities than what my parents or my grandparents' generations had, and I think it is actually very disappointing tonight to repeatedly hear over and over and over again that this means that we've been failed. Folks, again, the motion is that we have been failed by the Good Friday Agreement. I agree, there's flaws, 100%, it's politics, come on, there's always flaws. But we have not been failed by it. What we have been failed is by the politicians who have came after that. Not a chance, but the biggest benefit, and I've said this over and over again, and why I will never say that the Good Friday Agreement was a failure, is that it did bring peace to the north of Ireland, or Northern Ireland, and it ended the violence here. 3,600 people. In fact, it was more than that. People's lives who were taken from them. 3,600 families who were never the same again. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, children on whose mental health changed forever. Millions of pounds of damage done to the economy. That is what the Troubles did to this island. Not even including what happened down the south, but I'm just looking at the north here. Now, if we were to have 1 minute of silence for each person, that's 60 hours. I don't have enough time here. But if we were to ask the families of those whose lives were taken during the years of the Troubles, that we could implement the Good Friday Agreement 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute before their loved one's lives was taken, do you think they would tell us, no, the Good Friday Agreement has failed us, so I think we'll wait off on that? No, they would not. They would implement it immediately if given the chance. Because we were afforded not to lose another 3,600 people's lives. Put your hand down. No. And I think to undermine that at all is actually despicable, and I think we need to really reevaluate what we're arguing here tonight. Peace is invaluable. It has allowed our generation not just to be under threat of death, but it has allowed us to actually live. And yes, there are problems. There is the brain drain. There's problems in our education, as I'm sure Peter Weir, who's Minister for Education, understands himself. I'm sure that everyone here has a problem with politics that we can talk about, but funnily enough, folks, you can talk about it now because we have democratic institutions that we are able to use and implement to talk about this. Now, I know that there's issues. I know that there are issues with democratic institutions not being able to be implemented. But again, that is due to politicians abusing the systems that came before them. It is due to them doing this intentionally, not the Good Friday Agreement that is there. Put your hand down. In the first place, I have too much to get through. This is the biggest argument. This is the biggest argument, perhaps the only argument that has really been put forward tonight by the proposition, is that some of us feel that the Good Friday Agreement failed us because of stagnation of government or the lack of a government that we have. The Good Friday Agreement was done in good faith. It was done to bring communities together and to allow people to have their political voices heard. Again, this has been abused and distorted by politicians. Folks, tonight we've all brought up our whether it be laptops or pieces of paper in order to speak in front of you here. If I take the book, however, that we've all agreed that I can use tonight, and I go and slap Tom across the face with it, that is me taking something in good faith and using it to harm another person. That is what our politicians are using. Put your hand down, is using our institutions to do. And I don't think that we can go, oh aye, it's the fault of the Good Friday Agreement. That is simply ridiculous. And Ciara, you said that we're naive. I think that is the height of naivety. And you know, Owen here, he can't even go into work because the DUP have decided they're going to manipulate the system yet again and sit outside the government. Maybe if the government, the politicians would get their act together and implement the Good Friday Agreement in the good faith that it was wrote in its entirety, our society would be like years ahead. Wait, maybe the answer to our question tonight is in that. If the politicians implemented the Good Friday Agreement in its entirety, in the way it was wrote in the first place, we wouldn't have the problems that we have today. So therefore, again, the problems lie with our politicians and not with our Good Friday Agreement. John Hume said that the whole world is in favour of this agreement. I think the House tonight should also be. Please oppose this motion. Please vote with the opposition. Garma.
Has been absolutely outstanding tonight, and I'd love to hear some audience questions. Now, how it's going to work is I'm going to say, for example, is there a question for the proposition? You'll ask the question, one person from the proposition can respond, and then a person from the opposition responds to that person from the proposition. So, are there any questions for the proposition tonight?
Good job, what's
if you want to just project your voice, please.
I have a question to the second speaker of the proposition tonight. Whenever we're aware of the situation in 1998 and what could have been achieved, he said, what missed opportunities. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what the opportunity might be at the time, if there was another agreement we could have had, and for a different future around that time.
Well, look, I think, as I indicated probably earlier on, I think that the biggest missed opportunities was around issues around decommissioning. I actually agree with one of the points. I think actually the proposer of the opposition, if I'm getting my terminology correct in that regard, made, which I think there was a failure to link in. I think that prisoner releases, created a vacuum in terms of justice, but I think at the very least, if that was going to happen and there was going to be something done with that, a failure to link in with decommissioning, and there was a level of a failure to tackle and confront the legacy of terrorism at a time, I think, when terrorism actually didn't really have a particular route back, and I think that created a weakness within our system. I think it is also the case. This comes in terms of the overall layout, because we've heard a lot tonight about failure subsequently of politicians, and politicians do fail at times. Was it something in that sense that was foreseeable? Because clearly by definition a lot of the blame will attach to the DUP and to Sinn Féin. I remember a friend of mine who subsequently became a representative of the Ulster Unionists many years later, saying a week after the agreement has created structures which incentivise communal advantage, that the party that can shout the loudest and fight the loudest for their community will be the one that will rise to the top. And if you dislike the DUP and Sinn Féin, the seeds of that were in many ways sown, I think, by the the agreement itself.
Yeah, opposition to respond?
I'll respond to that. Can we use that? I think that's an excellent question, because that's the question that is always asked within unionism. What if we had held out longer? And what would have happened had David Trimble said, I need another 2 weeks? Here's what I think. And I've thought of this over many years, and I've had to focus on it in the past month or two as I have spoken to people about Good Friday 1998. The deal that was done on Good Friday 1998 was the only deal that was capable of being done at that time. The Ulster Unionists had put to the two governments that if prisoner releases were going to happen, that they could happen over 5 years, but they needed to be linked to decommissioning. The problem with that proposition was that Sinn Féin wanted the IRA prisoners out in 1 year. Gerry Adams and Gerry Kelly specifically, had spoken to David Irvine of the PUP, and David Irvine said, I don't think the unionist community are going to wear that. Could we not do it in 2 years? So between the Loyalist parties and Sinn Féin, they agreed it would be 2 years. And David Trimble was told by the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach, I suppose, that that was as good as it was going to get. Now, we can talk till the cows come home as to whether, if David Trimble had said, well, that's not good enough, I'm not having this, we would have had to walk out at that point. Gerry Adams, I don't believe, could have carried the IRA and the Republican community with him had he agreed to what we wanted. So we ended up in a situation with a very, very precariously, finely balanced compromise that was the only compromise that was going to work on that day. So I spoke at a thing with Barney Rowan of the BBC recently on that issue as well. And what the outside world couldn't see at that time was what was going on within republicanism and the huge compromises that republicanism were making to be in the talks and to agree to the constitutional aspects of the agreement that this man and others in the Ulster Unionists negotiated with the SDLP. I believe, and it's a regret clearly of mine, that there wasn't linkage, but I believe it wasn't possible to get it on that day, and we had to take it or leave it.
Great. Do we have any questions for the opposition? We'll go to Dermot at the back.
So this question will come up for the Speaker on the opposition. You mentioned how it's the feelings of politicians, it's the feelings of people that the Good Friday Agreement and institutions have let people down, have let our generation down. Surely the fact that they have the option to pull it down, surely the fact that we gave them the weapons to harm Northern Ireland with, in terms of pulling the institutions down, destroying governance, your argument very much to me comes off as the American kind of pro-gun argument of guns don't kill people, people kill people. Surely that argument, and what I ask you is, do you not recognise that by handing those institutions, handing the opportunity to pull governance down, that therefore it's that rather than simply because politicians suck? Now, granted, believe me, no one has turned into Lord Weir as much as I did when he was Education Minister. I think politicians are really bad. I'm not defending them, as everyone in this panel knows. But what I'm asking you is, do you not recognise the dangers of handing such institutions to politicians and giving them the opportunity to tear everything down?
Oh, Derek, I saw your hand go up 50 times. I know you're away. First of all, I am not pro-gun. Let me just reassure everyone in this room if that came across like I'm going to have to very much on speech back. But I do understand the concern, and I do understand it's a fairly, I wouldn't say it's a convoluted argument, I would just say it's a fairly grey argument, as with is everything with the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. I would say at the time it was quite necessary to include that. We were talking about a society where one side did not necessarily trust the other, where it was a very divisive society, and where people wanted to feel protected. Because we're talking about Stormont was set up, and again, I don't care what side of things, factually it was set up as a crossing government for a crossing people, and it was set up in order to maintain that. Now you have two sides of the community who felt that they didn't trust one another, and they felt that they didn't trust the other side to protect their rights, to protect their interests, and it was the inclusion of this part that I would say alleviated a lot of concerns that, if you're not protecting my people's rights and my people's identity, then we can program the children. It ensures that the rights of the minority at the time was protected. Now there's concerns in that, and that the non-designated parties, I'm sure everyone would agree with this, is that you have your alliance parties who now are very, very strong in society, and they're not able to access the main spotlight in Stormont. So there is problems, there is flaws, and we're not arguing for it isn't. That would be naive, that would be hypocritical. But to say that the Good Friday Agreement has failed us on the basis of this is wrong, and I think to absolve politicians who again are grown people who are playing with peace like petulant children, and they know what they're doing, and they are seeing something in our politics that they are able to manipulate and harm, and they know that they're doing this. I think it is ridiculous to turn around and to say it is the fault of an agreement that brought us so many successes and so many fantastic benefits for our society all those 25 years ago, and then to determine that it has failed us based on the one thing that people are not taking it in good faith. People are not taking it in the manner in which it was included with. People are doing it intentionally to manipulate and abuse. So, yeah, thank you.
Proposition to respond.
Alright, so I said this in my speech, I think I'll reiterate this. The Good Friday Agreement set out a structure of government that requires two sides that have been fighting directly for 30 years and indirectly for hundreds of years to get along for it to function. And I think we can all see the logical flaw in that setup just out the bat. The fact that it requires both sides to just get to agree on practically everything, and if they don't, it forces the entire government down, is a flaw, especially since there's no penalty to this, if that makes sense. They don't lose their salaries. So basically what happens is, okay, we don't agree with this, we'll bring the entire government down, which essentially usurps democracy in a way as well. Essentially there have been things like the LGBTQ issue and the abortion issue that have gotten democratic support on this island, and they haven't been able to be implemented, because every time a party didn't want it, government down, government down, government down. And then that, and then the second thing as well, which is a very important issue, is the petition of concern, which again has a shocking lack of limitations on it. It can be used on practically anything. Like I said in my speech, but it's been used to essentially halt investigations into MLA wrongdoings, for example, and has been used on issues that have nothing really to do with the green orange divide. And it's been used to an ungodly degree with such a lack of limitations on it that could have been foreseen. As I said in my speech, as we all know, in history, all politicians have never abused their power whatsoever. And that's the main issue of the Good Friday Agreement. It's reasonable to presume that these two things would have been problems, and it failed to implement any limitations or consequences if, for example, the petition of concern was used in an ungodly amount, or they weren't in government for 2/5 of the entire lifespan, I think, to this day, roughly. And that's the issue, and that came from the Good Friday Agreement. But that's what I mean. You can't just go, right, they'll definitely get along, people. They definitely will. No, they wouldn't. And you had to predict for that, which they didn't do. And that's the main issue of this, which stemmed from the Good Friday Agreement. So I don't think it's a thing of, politicians are bad. Politicians are always bad, and you should have accounted for that. And I think that's the main issue with this entire thing. But yeah.
And do we have any abstaining questions? So not necessarily for either side. Oh, yeah.
Hi, thanks. It seems to me, having listened to both sides, that the main question actually is what does it mean to fail? Because, I mean, almost every speech follows the same structure. We have these problems, but, and then the but was, it's still good, or it's still bad. And, you know, there's an exception to that, which is we have the thing about decommissioning, and there can be disagreements about how that ought to have been done, or how the reason of the prisoners ought to have been done, but I just maybe, if you give some clarity, decide on what would it actually mean for it to have failed. Because being in power for 3/5 of the time is pretty bad. And when we heard that, the problems are clear. And I agree that to say it failed, it does have a reputational impact. And I think that's what you were talking about, which is that this gave us peace, so we shouldn't be so quick to deride it. But yeah, I guess I don't know where to stand, because I don't know what it means for this to fail. Can you guys maybe?
Opposition want to go first?
Not be really cliche when we like that Dairy Girls quote about like, you know, what if it doesn't work? Well, I think in the first instance it is that, and I always believed this up until 4 years ago, that it was success was people not dying, and then I had like a personal experience of knowing someone that died because of political violence here. So there is a question about how much success can be measured on that, and I think then the second kind of measure of success is what space actually is there for political debate and discussion, and do people feel that they can have political debate and discussion in space without it resorting straight away to positions where people feel that they're afraid and people feel they're threatened, and if they can do it in social circles and it not be a big deal. One of my closest friends is a DP MLA, and we kind of have a bit of a running joke about when we go to the pub who gets more abuse, me or him. And actually, more often than not, it's me, and I think it's because I'm slightly more recognizable than he is. And that wouldn't have been possible, I don't think. 25 years ago, I mean, some of the friendships that existed between politicians who were involved in writing the agreement were things that they had to keep secret. Some of the funny stories that come out, the human and personal stories of the people involved in the agreement, are things that have been kept for 20, 25 years because people felt that maybe telling them opened you up to this accusation or suggestion that you were too pally or too friendly with the other side. So that is the kind of second test as to whether or not that the agreement has actually failed. And I think the third test is what opportunity is there for people to have constitutional viewpoints whilst also being able to work together on issues. And the Assembly and the Executive doesn't require people to agree on everything. That's why it has the ability to divide and to vote on issues. And God knows that I've worked at the Assembly, I've seen plenty of days the division bell can go morning, noon and night. But it allows people at the very least to find some commonality. I was really proud in the last Assembly, the MLA that I worked with wrote the period poverty bill, an example of the Assembly actually being able to work for people across the whole of Northern Ireland and deliver on something. And unfortunately, implementation of that bill is now held up because the Assembly is down. But it demonstrated that place can actually work in writing legislation and passing it that can have a major positive impact on people's lives. But it shows that people from differing constitutional political viewpoints can work together on something and actually be able to get it passed. So I think those are, for me, the three tests as to whether or not the agreement works, and it passes on all three, despite the political difficulties and despite the failure of politicians. And to very quickly rebut some of the points in relation to whether or not politicians have failed, and the failure of people who elect them to make choices as well.
Proposition to respond.
Reach across the divide.
On the topic of what failure is, I think the US metaphor is an interesting one that I might try and continue. I see the Good Friday Agreement, and I think a great many people do, see the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland back in the day as sort of the base layer of what Northern Ireland is today. It is it's effectively our political constitution. It sets out the frameworks of the institutions that we have, of the society that we have. So if, say for example, we look at the United States, and the US Constitution is hated for all that it is, but if the US government wasn't sitting for 3/5 of the time that it was up, and the government sat and did nothing, and continued to just bicker and then refused to sit in the Senate or in the House, and the President didn't do anything and didn't speak to anybody, and nothing happened, we would call America a political failure. And we'd be looking for, I don't use the word constitutional change because it's kind of loaded in this context, but we'd be looking to change the Constitution somehow. I think, and I'm aware, we've all said it, I think that the Good Friday Agreement gave us peace, and none of us are taking away from that, and the idea that we are is absurd. We're all happy there's peace. Peace is a good thing. We can all agree that peace is good, yay for peace. But it's everything that's come after that. I mean, talking about space for debate in social circles, I mean, Kieran mentioned there still is an uncertainty and that feeling of sometimes unsafety of speaking politically in a social environment, of what you want to say and who's listening, which is it's an old trope that's probably gone down through the years, but it's still there and it still exists. Having peace is fundamentally a brilliant thing, but it's the opportunities that have come since, and the experiences that we sort of haven't maybe been afforded to the same extent that we wanted to have, that are facilitated within the system of the Good Friday Agreement. Things like, which haven't really been addressed, I said about the brain drain, the lack of jobs, sort of the poor university places, things like that aren't here, that we deserve to have. We deserve to have peace fundamentally. We deserve to have also more than peace. Having a peaceful society is brilliant, but having a peaceful society that works is more important. I don't think we have that. I think there is fault to lie, certainly for one more batch of politicians, and politicians, but there is also certain, we have to look at this in the round and see that the politicians are playing in the playground that was made for them by the Good Friday Agreement.
Brilliant. So now we move on to our vote on speaker ability. So this isn't about your own personal opinion. This is what side you think had the most convincing points and spoke best tonight. So if you'd like to vote for the proposition you thought they spoke best tonight, please raise your hand now.
Vote right?
You're not going to vote for yourself.
Do us a favour, let's go.
I know. Okay.
You get that? Okay. And if you think that the opposition spoke best tonight, please raise your hand now.
Look good.
I think you.
It's a resounding one for peace there, isn't it?
And if you'd like to abstain because you don't think that either spoke best or you just can't decide, please raise your hand now.
Who thought we were Owen, get him
Better to be in the middle of the road than in the gutter, Peter.
Could I have a vote?
We're likely to get back home on the road.
On the question of speaker ability, then, there were 14 votes for proposition. 30.
Goodness.
7 abstaining votes, which means that the opposition still has it.
Well done to the opposition. Thank you to all of our speakers here tonight. The quality of debate was absolutely amazing. Thank you for everyone who came, and thank you to the Imagine Festival. And also to Brian, who wants to say something.
Yes. There are two things I want to say. Firstly, are we going to Margaret's?
Yes.
Yes, okay. The first thing is, if you want to carry on the debate at the pub, we're going to go to Laveri's. So I think I need a drink after this, and any of you might as well. The second thing is, tomorrow we have our annual formal, the Conversazione, which goes all the way back to the 1800s, the literary figures hosted, and it's in the Ulster Reform Club. Dr. Stephen Goss is kindly hosting us there tomorrow, so if you fancy a nice dinner, it's £30 for members and £35 for non-members, so just come up and ask me for how to pay for that and everything, and I will get it sorted. So those are my two.
So thank you for everyone coming tonight, and if you'd like to see this again, we do weekly debates every Thursday at 7 p.m. in the Senate room. Thank you.
Just a quick second, for anyone that either is interested in attending the Lurific or is a member, our final debate of the year will be on the 27th of April, which will be 90 years after the Lurific last debated it, which will be "This House would not fight for King and Country." We will have spots on either side of the debate. We're hoping to put some of our best speakers on it. We're also hoping to maybe get a couple of guest speakers, so if any of our guests want to come along or take part, give us a shout. But if you want to sign up, find me in the